The pen was already touching the paper. 1,800 jobs. 12 years. One signature. Victoria Caldwell, whose face had graced the cover of Forbes, whose name had become synonymous with American biotech, sat motionless at the head of the table, surrounded by lawyers and board members, who had long run out of answers. The bankruptcy filing lay open before her. Chapter 11. Clean. Final. The room held its breath like a jury waiting for a verdict no one wanted to deliver. Her hand didn't shake. It never did. Then small shoes on marble. A child's voice, unhurried and impossibly clear, slicing through $100 million worth of silence. "Madam, you missed this number." A 5-year-old girl in a blue dress stood in the doorway holding a single page of financial report. One small finger pressed firmly against a number no one else had ever questioned. What happened next, nobody saw coming. The 38th floor of the Caldwell Biotech headquarters was not the kind of place where things were left to chance. Every detail had been deliberate. The floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Chicago skyline, the long obsidian conference table that could seat 22, the way the morning light fell at precisely the right angle to remind whoever sat at its head exactly how far they had come. Victoria Caldwell had chosen this office herself 12 years ago, when the company was still operating out of a rented room in Boston that cost $200 a month and smelled faintly of old carpet and ambition. She had not come from money. She had not come from connections. She had come from the kind of stubborn, grinding belief that if you worked harder than everyone else in the room, you eventually got to choose the room. And she had. By 32, Caldwell Biotech was producing medical devices in 3 states. By 35, 6. By 38, her face was on the cover of Forbes' America's Most Powerful Women in Business, and 1,800 people across the country came to work each morning because of decisions she made. Her leadership style was not micromanagement. It was vision. She hired people smarter than herself in every specific discipline, accounting, legal, logistics, R&D, and she trusted them completely. She read the outputs. She made the calls. She moved fast because in the biotech industry, speed was survival. That philosophy had built an empire. It had also, without her knowing it, allowed a quiet error to grow unchecked for 4 months in the accounting software no one had thought to question. 3 floors below the executive level in a utility corridor that smelled of industrial cleaner and old fluorescent light, Daniel Reeves was replacing a faulty circuit panel he had flagged 2 weeks prior. He was 34 years old, lean from work rather than exercise, with the kind of hands that knew every mechanical system in the building better than some people knew their own addresses. He had been a maintenance technician at Caldwell Biotech for 6 years, long enough to know which elevators ran slow in winter, which conference rooms had heating vents that rattled during presentations, and which managers left the break room coffee pot empty without starting a new batch. He was good at his job. Quiet, reliable, and visible in the way that essential people often are. That morning, the woman who usually watched his daughter had called in sick. Daniel had no backup. He had brought Lily with him, as he sometimes did, settling her in the employee break room on sub-level 2 with her books, and a sandwich checking on her every 40 minutes with the precision of a man who understood that this arrangement existed on borrowed time. He was aware every single day that one wrong moment could end it. When his work order moved him up to the mechanical systems near the 38th floor, he had brought Lily along rather than leave her alone 2 floors below. He set her in the hallway just outside the service corridor, a quiet stretch of marble between the elevator bank and the conference wing, with her workbook open in her lap, telling her to stay exactly where she was. Sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, her small legs stretched out in front of her, was his daughter. Lily was 5 years old, and entirely unbothered by the fact that she was spending her Tuesday morning on the 38th floor of a corporate high-rise. She had the workbook open, not a coloring book, not a picture book, but a workbook, the kind with rows of numbers printed in neat columns and empty boxes waiting to be filled. It had belonged to her mother. Most of her books had. Her mother, Claire, had been a middle school math teacher in the years before she got sick. She had a particular belief, one she had shared with Lily, from before the girl could fully articulate why she liked it, that numbers were the most honest thing in the world. They didn't have moods. They didn't change their minds. They simply were what they were, and if something looked wrong, it was wrong, and all you had to do was look carefully enough to find out why. Claire had been gone for 2 years. Daniel still read numbers with Lily every night before bed, street addresses, page counts, the temperature on the weather app, because it was the one ritual he hadn't been able to bring himself to stop. The contract with the Federal Department of Health had been the kind of opportunity that redefines a company. Victoria had spent 14 months pursuing it, restructuring entire production lines, hiring additional compliance staff, converting 2 facilities in Ohio to meet federal-grade specifications. When the department announced a sudden policy shift that voided the contract framework entirely, she didn't panic publicly. She absorbed the news in a conference call, thanked the department liaison for his time, ended the call, and then sat alone in her office for 11 minutes before walking back into the building as if nothing had changed. What followed was 20 months of controlled deterioration. She cut costs in layers first, the non-essentials, then the near-essentials, then things she had once considered untouchable. She sold personal assets. She restructured debt. She renegotiated with every creditor willing to take a meeting. Competition from overseas manufacturers had compressed margins further than her projections accounted for, and each quarter the gap between where the company was and where it needed to be grew slightly wider. She told no one how bad it had gotten. Not fully. What she also didn't know, what no one on her financial team knew, because no one had gone looking, was that the new accounting software integrated 4 months earlier had been quietly misrepresenting the company's cash flow data since the day it went live. A formatting error buried deep in the system's configuration was displaying one significant receivable in the wrong unit denomination. The software showed thousands. The actual figure was in millions, because everyone on the team was reviewing the outputs the software produced rather than the raw data underneath it. The error had compounded through every report, every projection, every presentation to the board, invisible, precise, and catastrophic in its implications. The numbers the board had been reading for 4 months were not the company's numbers. They were a shadow of them. The emergency session was called for 9 in the morning. By 8:55, every seat at the long obsidian table was filled. The board members had flown in from 4 cities. The lead counsel had a briefcase open in front of him, with the Chapter 11 filing already tabbed and indexed. The CFO sat with his hands flat on the table, not looking at anyone. Victoria arrived at 9 o'clock exactly. She sat at the head of the table, set her phone face down, and listened for 22 minutes as the lawyers and board members walked through a situation she already knew better than any of them. The federal contract loss, the revenue compression, the creditor timelines, the investor withdrawals, every option that had been attempted, and the reason each one had failed. At the end of the 22 minutes, the lead counsel slid the bankruptcy filing across the table to her. Chapter 11. Clean. Final. The logic was airtight. Signed today, and the company entered a structured protection process with a chance to reorganize. Waite and the creditors who had already extended beyond their own limits would move to force a Chapter 7 liquidation within weeks. A controlled bankruptcy was survivable. A forced one was not. Everyone in the room knew what the right answer was. Victoria picked up the pen. She did not look at the filing. She looked for a moment at the window, at the city spread out below the glass, at the gray November sky, at nothing in particular. 1,800 people. 12 years. 1 signature. Her hand moved toward the paper, and somewhere down the hall, a door that had been left slightly ajar swung open, and small shoes clicked against marble, and a voice that had absolutely no business being on the 38th floor of a Chicago high-rise said clearly and without hesitation, "Madam, you missed this number." No one moved. That was the first thing, the absolute stillness that dropped over the conference room like a physical weight. 22 years of combined legal experience on one side of the table, decades of financial oversight on the other, a CFO who had navigated 3 corporate restructurings, a lead counsel who had filed more Chapter 11 petitions than he could count without checking his records, and every single one of them stood frozen, staring at a 5-year-old girl in a blue dress who was holding a single page pulled from the document cart outside one sheet. She had lifted while passing because it was covered in numbers, and numbers were always worth looking at. The board member closest to the door found his voice first. "Who let a child in here?" No one answered because no one knew. Lily didn't look at him. She was looking at Victoria, the way children look at the person they've decided is in charge, directly without strategy, without any awareness that this was not the kind of room you walked into, and said what you thought. She took 2 more steps forward and set the page on the edge of the table. Her finger stayed on the number. Victoria set the pen down. Not dramatically. Quietly, the way you set something down when you need both hands free to think. She had built this company on a specific kind of discipline, the discipline of not reacting until she understood. She had learned it early in a life that had not given her the luxury of emotional response before information. So she did not dismiss the child, and she did not invite her further in. She simply looked at what the girl was pointing at. It was the cash flow summary page. 2 columns of figures, a bolded total at the bottom. Nothing Victoria hadn't seen dozens of times in the past 4 months. "Ms. Caldwell." The lead counsel's voice was measured but firm. "We have a filing deadline with the court. Every hour we delay increases the exposure." The head of the accounting team, a man named Robert Haynes, who had spent the past 72 hours without adequate sleep, preparing the documentation that now filled 4 binders on the conference table, leaned forward. He was not a man who raised his voice, but there was a tightness in his jaw that communicated everything his tone didn't. "We have 40 years of combined experience in this room," Haynes said. "This filing has been through 3 independent audits. I understand this is an unusual situation, but we cannot restructure our entire timeline because—" He stopped himself, recalibrated. "The numbers have been verified." Repeatedly, Victoria looked at Lily. The girl had not moved. She was still pointing at the same spot on the page, waiting with the patience of someone who had not yet learned that adults sometimes needed convincing before they looked at what was right in front of them. There was something about that, the absence of performance in it, the complete lack of campaign, that kept Victoria from picking up the pen again. She thought for a fraction of a moment about Marcus Webb from the logistics division, who had bought a house in Evanston 6 weeks ago and mentioned it in the elevator with the kind of quiet pride that people reserve for things they've worked toward for years. She thought about Sandra Okafor from R&D, 7 months pregnant, who had stopped by Victoria's office last Thursday to drop off a project update and stayed 3 minutes longer than necessary because she still believed the company was going to be fine. 1,800 people. She knew more of their names than anyone would have expected. She had always known their names. "Give me 5 minutes," Victoria said. The door opened before anyone could respond to that. Daniel Reeves arrived at a speed that was just short of running the specific gait of a man who has realized something has gone wrong and is trying to correct it before the consequences fully materialize. He was still holding his work radio. His eyes went immediately to Lily, then to the room, then back to Lily, and the color in his face shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the walk up from the service corridor. "I am so sorry." He crossed the room and put his hand on Lily's shoulder. "Lily, come on. Right now." He looked up at the table, at no one and everyone. "I'm sorry. She must have wandered. I was down the hall. I didn't know she'd—" "It's all right," Victoria said. Her voice was even. "It is genuinely not all right," the board member near the door said. Daniel was already steering Lily toward the exit. The girl went, but she turned her head back toward the table, toward the page she'd left there. The expression on her face one of mild confusion. The confusion of someone who had pointed out something obvious, and could not understand why it required this much commotion. The moment the door closed behind them, the room exhaled. Robert Haynes was already at his laptop, pulling up the full data set. 2 members of his team did the same. They worked quickly, running a live verification of the totals, cross-referencing against the audited figures, checking the summary page Lily had touched against the supporting schedules behind it. After 4 minutes, Haynes looked up. "We've run it again. There is no discrepancy. The numbers are confirmed." A board member who had flown in from Atlanta that morning spread his hands on the table. "Victoria, we need to move." Victoria had not picked up the pen. She was looking at the cash flow summary page that Lily had left on the table's edge, the single page, the 2 columns, the bolded total. The girl had not said the total was wrong. She had said a number was missed. There was a difference. Victoria wasn't entirely sure why that distinction had lodged itself in her mind, but it had. She pulled the page toward her and looked at it the way she had not looked at a financial document in years, not as a summary, not as a conclusion, but as a set of raw inputs to be questioned. The 2 columns, the individual line items, the figures that fed into the total at the bottom. Then she opened her personal laptop. "Ms. Caldwell," the lead counsel said. "5 minutes," she said. I said 5 minutes. She was not accessing the audited reports. She was not pulling up the verified outputs that Haynes and his team had spent 3 days preparing. She was going further back to the source database, the raw data files that existed before the accounting software processed them and generated the reports that everyone in this room had been reading for 4 months. She had not done this herself in years. She had trusted the system because the system had always worked. She navigated through file directories she hadn't personally opened since the software migration, and it took her longer than it should have because the architecture had changed in ways she hadn't kept up with. 11 minutes, not 5. No one spoke. She found it on the receivables ledger. It was not dramatic the way it appeared on screen. It was a single line item, a significant outstanding receivable from a long-term equipment contract, displayed in a column labeled in thousands of dollars. The figure shown was in the range that had been feeding their cash flow projections as a moderate asset, workable, but not substantial. Except the raw data field didn't match the display. Victoria stared at the screen. She clicked through to the configuration settings for the software integration that had gone live 4 months earlier. And there it was, a formatting parameter that had been set to the wrong denomination during the initial setup. The software had been taking the raw figure, which was denominated in millions, and displaying it as if it were thousands. A receivable worth several $1,000,000 had been rendering in every report, every projection, every board presentation for 4 months as a fraction of its actual value. The accounting team had verified everything the software produced. They had checked every output with precision. No one had gone back to look at whether the software itself was reading the source data correctly, because no one had thought to ask that question. The auditors had worked from the same outputs. The error existed in a layer that 3 rounds of independent audit had never reached. The bolded total at the bottom of the cash flow summary was not wrong by arithmetic. It was wrong because one of the numbers feeding into it had been misread by the system from the beginning, which meant every projection built on top of it, every creditor conversation, every restructuring model, every argument for why Chapter 11 was the only remaining option, had been built on a foundation that did not reflect reality. Victoria sat back. She was aware of the room around her, the board members, the lawyers, Haynes and his team watching her from across the table, with expressions that had shifted from impatience to something more careful. She was aware of the filing on the table in front of her, of the pen she had not picked up again, of the November sky outside the glass. What she felt in that moment was not relief. Relief would come later, and it would be complicated. What she felt first was something closer to vertigo, the sensation of realizing that the ground you had been standing on for months was not where you thought it was. She turned the laptop around so Robert Haynes could see the screen. She didn't explain. She pointed at the configuration field the same way Lily had pointed at the page directly without theater. Haynes looked at it. He leaned closer. He looked at it again. The room watched him work through it in real time, the moment his expression shifted the way his hands went flat on the table. The small, controlled exhale that was the closest a man of his composure would come to showing what he was actually feeling. "That's a denomination error," he said. His voice was careful. "In the integration settings." "Yes," Victoria said. "That would have affected every cash flow report since the migration." "Yes." The lead counsel set down his pen. The board member from Atlanta was very still. Haynes ran the corrected figure through his laptop. It took less than 90 seconds. When he looked up, the expression on his face had completed its transformation into something none of the people in that room had expected to see when they walked in that morning. With the correct receivable figure, he said, "The cash flow position is materially different. We would need to remodel the full picture, but at first review." He stopped, recalculated, looked at the screen once more. "We are not where we thought we were." Victoria did not respond immediately. She looked at the unsigned filing on the table, at the pen beside it. 1,800 people. 12 years. One number that a 5-year-old girl had noticed because her mother had taught her that numbers never lied. You only had to look carefully enough. Victoria closed the laptop. "We're not signing today," she said. The room emptied slowly. Board members gathered their materials with the particular efficiency of people who had prepared for one outcome and were now recalibrating for something entirely different. The lead counsel packed the Chapter 11 filing back into his briefcase without comment, not because there was nothing to say, but because none of them had yet found the right language for what had just happened. Robert Haynes stayed behind with 2 members of his team, already deep in a remodeling exercise that would take most of the night. The CFO, a methodical man named Gerald Walsh, pulled his chair close to Haynes and began working through the corrected figures with the focused quiet of someone who understood that the real work was only beginning. Not everyone left in silence. One board member, a man named Clifford Marsh, who had joined the board 4 years earlier and had never entirely warmed to Victoria's style of leadership, stopped at the door on his way out. He didn't raise his voice. He was too deliberate for that. "The software error doesn't change what allowed it to happen," Marsh said. "A critical integration went live without parallel testing. That's a process failure at the executive level. I want that on record before we have any conversations about what comes next." Victoria met his eyes. "It's already on my record," she said. "It doesn't need yours." Marsh left. The door closed. She stood at the window for a long time after that, watching the city below, while behind her, Gerald and Haynes rebuilt the company's financial picture from the ground up. The corrected numbers, when fully modeled, told a different story than the one the board had been reading for 4 months. Not a comfortable story, not a story without difficulty, but a survivable one. With the receivable accurately represented, Caldwell Biotech qualified for a bridge loan facility that their current position had appeared to preclude. The debt was real. The restructuring requirement was real. The creditor relationships that had frayed over 20 months of difficult conversations would need to be rebuilt with patience and documentation and time. None of that had changed. What had changed was the foundation underneath all of it. Gerald confirmed it just after 10 o'clock that evening, setting his reading glasses on the table and pressing his hands flat in the way he did when he had finished arriving at a conclusion. "We have a viable path," he said. "It will require bridge financing, a revised creditor proposal, and probably 6 months of close monitoring. But the company is not where we thought it was this morning, not even close." Victoria nodded once. She did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate yet, and she was not a person who confused relief with resolution. "Start drafting the revised creditor framework," she said. "I want to present it within the week." Gerald and Haynes left together, still talking. The support staff followed. And then Victoria was alone on the 38th floor in a room that had held 20 people 8 hours earlier, and now held only the long obsidian table, the November dark, outside the glass, and the Chapter 11 filing that no one had thought to take away. She sat down at the head of the table, not at her laptop, not on the phone. She simply sat, which was something she had not done without purpose, in longer than she could precisely recall. The filing was still there in its blue folder tabs and all. She did not touch it. She had built the company on speed, on vision, on the principle that you hired people who were better than you in every specific room, and then you trusted them, and then you moved. That principle had not been wrong. It had built something real, something that employed 1,800 people across 6 states, something that had genuinely advanced the field of medical device manufacturing in ways she was proud of. But somewhere along the way, trust had quietly become a substitute for verification. Delegation had become distance. She had read the outputs and made the calls and moved fast, and she had told herself that was leadership, and in many ways it was. But it was also a way of never having to sit in the discomfort of not knowing everything, because she could always point to a system that was supposed to know it for her. The software error had not been invisible because it was cleverly hidden. It had been invisible because no one had looked for it. No one had thought to go back to the layer beneath the outputs, to question not just the numbers, but the process that produced the numbers, to ask whether the foundation itself was sound. That question had not been in anyone's job description, not Robert Haynes's, not Gerald's, not the independent auditor's. It had been in hers. It had always been in hers. She had approved the software migration. She had signed off on the integration timeline without requiring parallel testing against the legacy system, because the vendor's track record was strong and the team was confident, and she had been moving fast the way she always moved. The question she sat with alone in the dark of the 38th floor was not whether she had made a mistake. She had. The question was, what kind of leader makes that mistake, and whether that was the kind of leader she had decided to be, or simply the kind she had become without noticing. She was not sure those were the same thing. The following morning, she called a meeting with Robert Haynes, his team, and Gerald, not in the main conference room, but in a smaller room down the hall, with no view and no pretension. She did not open with analysis. She did not begin with the corrected figures or the revised path forward. The software integration was my approval, she said. The testing protocol was my decision. Whatever we build going forward has to start from the acknowledgement that the gap in our process existed at the top, not at the level of the people who worked within it. I want that to be clear before we talk about anything else. Haynes was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had spent his career being precise, and she could see him weighing the precision of what she had just said. The team worked with what the system produced, he said. If there's a lesson here, it's that verified outputs are only as reliable as the inputs that generated them. Yes, Victoria said, and it's my job to know that. Not yours. It was not a long meeting. What mattered was said. The rest was operational. Gerald walked her through the bridge financing application that afternoon, and within 48 hours, the revised creditor framework was in draft. The path forward was narrow, and it required the kind of sustained, methodical work that would not be visible on any single day. But it was a path, and it was real, and Caldwell Biotech would walk it. She found Daniel Reeves on the afternoon of the second day through a call to the building operations manager. She asked for him, specifically by name, which she was aware was not the kind of request a maintenance technician typically received from the executive floor. She met them in the employee break room on sub-level 2. It was a small room, a coffee machine, a round table with 4 chairs, a window that looked out at a concrete retaining wall. Lily was already there when Victoria arrived, sitting in one of the chairs with a workbook open in her lap, legs swinging above the floor in the same unhurried way they had the day before. Daniel was standing near the coffee machine with the posture of a man who was not sure whether he was about to be thanked or terminated. Victoria sat down across from Lily. She did not make the interaction formal, and she did not position it as a reward. She just sat down the way you sit down when you actually want to talk to someone. "Can you show me," Victoria said to Lily, "what you saw yesterday in the report?" Lily looked at her father. Daniel gave a small nod. The girl set her workbook on the table and thought about it for a moment. Not performing the thinking, just actually doing it the way children do before they've learned to make cognition look effortless. "The numbers in the side column," she said. "When I added them up, they didn't make the big number at the bottom. The big number is supposed to be what everything adds up to." She looked at Victoria directly. "That's what a total is." "That's right," Victoria said. "So the numbers didn't match," Lily said. "Mom said numbers don't lie. If something doesn't match, you missed something. You just have to look." Daniel turned slightly toward the coffee machine. His shoulders moved in a way that was not quite a breath. Victoria kept her eyes on Lily. "Your mom taught you that?" Lily nodded. "She said it a lot." A beat. Before she got sick. The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet, when something real has just been said in them. "Do you like math?" Victoria asked. "I like numbers," Lily said with the precision of someone making an important distinction. "Math is when you have to show your work. Numbers are just true." Victoria looked at the workbook on the table, the columns of figures, the careful pencil marks in the margins where Lily had checked her own answers. She thought about a woman she had never met, who had understood well enough to pass it to her daughter, that the most important thing about a number was not what it said, but whether you were willing to look at it honestly. She asked one more question. "Do you want to keep learning math numbers, all of it?" Lily nodded immediately. Then, with the candor that belongs only to children and to people who have stopped caring about appearances, she added, "Dad says the good math books are expensive." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Victoria nodded. She didn't make promises in that moment. She simply said, "I know," and meant more by it than the words contained. What followed happened over the course of weeks, not in a single dramatic announcement. Victoria established a scholarship fund, named for Claire Reeves, Lily's mother, that would cover Lily's full educational journey from elementary school through university, including enrollment in accelerated math and science programs as she became eligible. It was not structured as a reward for what Lily had done. Victoria was deliberate about that distinction, because what Lily had done was not a performance. It was simply who the girl was, and that deserved support on its own terms. Daniel was promoted to building operations manager, a role that came with a salary that reflected what he had actually been doing for 6 years. The position had been vacant for 8 months. It had simply never occurred to anyone on the facilities committee that the most qualified person for the job had been doing most of the work already. The larger change was harder to quantify, but more significant than either of those things. Victoria redesigned the internal controls framework for financial reporting from the ground up, not just the accounting processes, but the assumptions underneath them. Parallel testing became mandatory for any new software integration touching financial data. Source-level verification was built into the quarterly audit cycle. These were process changes, and process changes could be documented and measured. But the thing she cared more about, the thing she spent more time on in conversations, and in the structure of how she held meetings, and in the specific language she used when she addressed the company, was the culture underneath the process. Anyone can say something. Not in the abstract, performative way that organizations sometimes gesture toward inclusivity, without meaning it, but in the specific structural way that meant there were actual channels, and actual people whose job it was to listen, and actual evidence over time that saying something led to something rather than nowhere. From the executive suite to the maintenance level, if you saw something that didn't add up, you said it. The company would listen. It was, she acknowledged privately, a principle she should have built in years earlier. 6 months after the morning on the 38th floor, Caldwell Biotech held a small internal gathering in the main conference room. The bridge financing had closed. The creditor restructuring was on track. The company was not fully recovered. That would take longer, but it was standing, and it was moving, and the 1,800 people who came to work each morning were still coming. Victoria had arranged for Lily and Daniel to be there. Lily arrived in a blue dress, not the same one, but the same shade. She sat in one of the large conference chairs, with her feet not quite reaching the floor, looking at the room with the measured curiosity she seemed to apply to everything, as if the world were a set of figures she was quietly checking for consistency. Victoria stood at the head of the table and kept her remarks short, because she had never believed that the length of a speech was proportional to its sincerity. She said that the company had come close to making a very large and irreversible mistake. She said that the reason it hadn't was not sophisticated analysis or executive instinct or anything that would look impressive on a resume. She said the reason was that someone in this building had looked at a page of numbers and trusted what she saw without needing anyone's permission to say it out loud. Then she walked to where Lily was sitting and handed her a framed certificate. Heavy cardstock, the company seal in the upper left corner, signed across the bottom by every member of the board, including Clifford Marsh, whose signature was smaller than the others, but present. Honorary Junior Analyst, Caldwell Biotech. Lily read it carefully. She looked up at Victoria. Does that mean I can come back and check more numbers? The room laughed, not politely, but genuinely, the way people laugh when something releases a pressure they didn't know they were carrying. Anytime, Victoria said. The Chapter 11. Filing that no one had signed was framed and hung on the wall of the 38th floor conference room beside a photograph taken that afternoon. Lily, in her blue dress, holding the certificate, her father, standing behind her, with the expression of a man who has not yet fully processed the fact that he is happy. Beneath the frame, on a small brass plate, a single line. The most important voice in the room doesn't always belong to the most important person in it. Years passed, the way years do in the accumulation of ordinary days that only reveal their shape in retrospect. Lily Reeves graduated at the top of her class in applied mathematics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She went on to complete her doctorate in computational data analysis, a field she described in her dissertation acknowledgments as the discipline of trusting what the numbers are actually saying rather than what you expect them to say. She cited her mother's influence in the first paragraph. She joined Caldwell Biotech as Director of Data Analytics at the age of 29. It was not a courtesy appointment. She had turned down 2 other offers, one from a firm in New York and one from a research institution in California, because she had decided years earlier that she wanted to work somewhere that already understood the value of looking carefully at what the numbers were telling you. On her first day in the new role, she took the elevator to the 38th floor and stood for a moment in front of the framed filing on the wall. The photograph beside it had faded slightly at the edges. She looked like herself. In it, the same stillness, the same directness in the eyes, just smaller. She took the elevator back down and went to work. The story of the girl in the blue dress had long since become part of how Caldwell Biotech understood itself. Told to new employees in orientation, referenced in company documents, occasionally misremembered in the retelling the way all true stories eventually are. What remained consistent across every version was the part that mattered, that truth does not adjust itself to fit the authority of the room it's in. It simply waits with the patience of a 5-year-old, pointing at a page for someone willing to look.